Once again, you are welcome to Searching Heart this fine morning. Today, I would want to talk about an important topic that, of course, is the issue that everybody is concerned about right now, which is the war in Iran. Okay? Of course, it is an important issue because many people feel that this might be that one war that might spark the Third World War. Of course, the Ukrainian conflict was one other conflict, but this one, because people were afraid that, of course, the Russian bloc of nations, allies to Russia, would come together if the West, NATO, got involved, and that would cause a crack in the world system, and of course the World War will begin. But of course we know that that did not happen because the interests in Ukraine are rather a little more parochial to the history between Ukraine and Russia itself, and have very, although may take a global outlook because of migration of Ukrainians all over the world, but is less able to cause such crises than what is going on right now, which is the coalition between America and Israel to attack Iran. Okay, so this is what has been going on for a few weeks now. And of course, discussing a lot of economic hardship around the world because of the rise in oil prices, of course arising from the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, which is an important trade route, taking oil from that region out into the rest of the world. Okay, and of course conflict itself has the capacity to do such things for many other reasons. Okay, so this is what we are seeing today, and before we can really look into this, we need to know why this conflict has begun or arisen. And for many reasons, which we will maybe try to look at today, that are more than what meets the eye, but for us to even understand those contemporary reasons that may be hiding in plain sight, let us look briefly at the history of Iran itself as a country. Okay, and we know that Iran itself is a very ancient civilization. Many of us don't really bother about Iran because, like India, it is was once part of the center of ancient civilizations. Okay, while there was a lot of conflict in the Middle East vis-a-vis the rise of the nation of Israel early on, around the third millennium, okay, BCE, we find that more stable civilizations were found within that axis, the Persian axis, which constitutes Persia and India. Okay, so there was a lot of conflict in the Middle East because of, it is believed, because of what God was doing, raising a people called Israel themselves. Okay, and while Egypt was the dominant power within the Middle East, Israel arose to take over that dominance. Okay, and this is what is believed by many Christians. Of course, in the secular narrative, you might want to categorize it a bit differently. We'll be looking at both narratives, and so we know that Iran was part of the Persian Empire. Okay, but also another perspective in which you might want to see is that it was also part of the Babylonian Empire. Because the historical borders at those times were relative to what it is now. So we find that Iran is part of that, okay? But Iran came up to the limelight, according to ancient history, through the conquest of the kings of the Medes and the Persians that conquered the kings of Babylon. Of course, these two kingdoms are neighbors. When you go to the west, you find the Babylonians, okay, a little to the west, more towards Turkey, moving eastward, of course, not westward. You find the Babylonians, okay, but when you go more eastward, you begin to find another kingdom called the Persians. Of course, the Babylonians were dominant over the Persians until the Persians themselves rose up and took over the Babylonian kingdom quite early in the. So this is what happened, and of course, when you look at the history, you are not talking about. It is mostly agreed that the people there in Iran today may not be the purest, in terms of demography, ethnic demography, because there were a lot of conquests, the conquest by the Greeks into the Middle East and into Persia, and the conquest by the Romans, So these caused a lot of mixing of people, along that line. And of course, knowing very well that the Persian Empire extends into India, you know that there are a lot of movements of people. So that is another discussion for another day. But Iran is what was known before as the Persian Empire, okay, in the whole. And notably, one of the most popular kings in the Persian Empire was Cyrus the Great. Okay, Cyrus was known and is popular for having set the Jews free. Okay, they were captives in Persia before Cyrus allowed them to be able to go back to Jerusalem and build back the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Okay, that's a very popular story, known not only from the Bible but also in secular history. Okay, so this is what we see very clearly, and from this very foundation we'll be able to know the influence of the Persian Empire and how it became Iran today. Key events that have taken place after these events are the establishment of the Achaemenid Empire in 550 BC, right there in Iran, and in 642 CE, the completion of the Muslim conquest. Islam now conquered Iran at 642 CE, quite early during the rise of Islam itself. Okay, quite early, and so this is why Iran today seems to be the epicenter of Islam itself. Although Saudi Arabia is the real center. Okay, but we know that Muhammad got a lot of influence outside Saudi Arabia before he finally conquered Mecca and Medina. Okay, so very early on, the Prophet Muhammad conquered the Persian Empire in Iran. Okay, where Iran is located today, was located in those days. Okay. So in 1501 AD, we see the rise of the Safavids and declaration of Shiism. This is according to Wikipedia. And the transformation of this state into Iran today was officially known to have happened in 1935. Okay, where the Shahs became the rulers of Iran, 1935, and again conquered through the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So this is the brief history of Iran itself as a country. we will now be able to see how this affects the current situation in Iran today. So we have seen a brief history of the nation, how Iran became Iran today. Of course, in 1979, there was an Islamic revolution conquering the Shahs of Iran and establishing a new state governed by a group of people who believed themselves to be descendants, direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, and so establishing their rule in Iran. Now, one would wonder, Saudi Arabia, the region covering Saudi Arabia, of course, is historically known to be the capital of Islam, established by Muhammad himself. But that region has a very peculiar history. Although being the homeland of the Prophet Muhammad himself, did not really quickly accept him as a prophet or as their leader, and he had to conquer those places by force. And up to today, of course, we know he established the traditions based on the city of Mecca itself as the holiest, Medina as the second holiest, surrounded around the holy site called the Kaaba, and there in those cities. Okay, so but because of the history, we find that the type of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia is a little different from Islam practiced around the world. Of course, the Shia and the Sunni being the two major sects. And of course, we know Saudi Arabia today is a more liberal form of Islam than found in most parts of the world, though still has a lot of influence in both sides. So this is the issue at stake here. The history of Islam seems to be repeating itself vis-a-vis the acceptability of descendants of the Prophet Muhammad in a place like Iran rather than in Saudi Arabia. Okay, I don't claim to be very conversant, although I have read quite wide about these things. I'll try to go back and look and see some of the other details that will bring out some of these historical links which establish the very lines of succession found in Islam. But we found that Islam began there, conquered Mecca and Medina a little late into the advent of Islam itself, and from there spread all over the world, right into Turkey, establishing what we know as the Ottoman Empire, down into North Africa, taking over Egypt and Morocco and Algeria, and if we know that after the death of Muhammad himself, there were just a few caliphates that were able to hold the kingdom, as it were, together, the whole caliphate together, and later on, of course, split into different factions. The Ottoman Empire up to the north, and other empires up to the south and to the east. One of those was, of course, in Iran. Okay, and of course we know Islam was able to spread right into India, up into Spain, and of course down into Africa, and came around as early as the 15th century into Mali. Okay, so this is in West Africa. Now we need to remember also that these were centers where Christianity had established itself, at least as a monarchy. Okay, establishing a Christian kingdom up in Nubia, that is Algeria, Sudan, Morocco, of course, and which started in Egypt itself with a very important center in Alexandria and Egypt, and also down into Ethiopia. Of course, Ethiopia has always been historically linked to both Judaism and Christianity. Okay, so these were centers that were popularly Christian centers that were now being conquered by Islam, because the Prophet of Islam himself believed that he was trying to revive the genuine religion. Okay, and so this is what happened. Okay, so Iran today is known to harbor these rich historical facts. Okay, that make it unique, and but is the only center that accommodates or harbors people who claim to be original descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so this is very, very peculiar, and because of this, somehow these factors have played together to be able to create an Iran that seems to be quiet, not really giving much attention, because Saudi Arabia is the center, and those countries that surround Saudi Arabia seems to be the center of Islam, and so Iran has really been allowed to develop on its own for years, although still very, very active on the political scene. And this is what has led to the crisis of today. Okay, this is a nation which has been allowed to be on its own and do whatever it wanted to do and strengthen itself in that light. Okay, and suddenly has come up to become a perceived threat to Western civilization. Okay, and this is what has led to the conflict that we are seeing today. Okay, now we will now see how this conflict of today actually evolved. We will all remember the war between Iraq. Like I said, Iran was not the center of attention. Countries like Iraq were the center of attention. Okay, because Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, was violently trying to establish himself as a superior power in the Middle East. We are sure that there have been also conflicts between Iraq and Iran too, because of the tendency for Saddam Hussein to do that. Okay, of course, America went in and they defeated Saddam Hussein, okay, in Iraq, and established a country. Of course, there are criticisms of how they did it, why they did it, and how they did it. Okay, and we're going to look at that again later on. Okay, and of course we know the little skirmishes around the Israel, of course, to the north, attacked by Hezbollah, and of course the struggle for the establishment of a Palestinian state. But we see that happening. Okay, but there were some key figures and some of the important threats. Of course, we know about Bin Laden, but Bin Laden evolved suddenly from nowhere. Being a citizen of Saudi Arabia, of course, but harboring in Afghanistan and other countries around, on his own, an independent person creating a network, okay, and attacking America itself, okay, and of course creating the wars that we see in Afghanistan and all that, okay, around the world. But there were some people that were notable, that were known to be key figures in this general uprising. And some of those figures, very important, was the person of Gaddafi. Okay, Gaddafi himself was a Pan-Africanist. Okay, but he held very peculiar views. Now, he was a bit weak in Africa because, of course, we know a very good percentage of African population is the black population, and Gaddafi was not in the strict sense a black person. Okay, of course we know that the issue of being black or not is debatable. Whether the North Africans are real Caucasian people or they are blacks, it's still a debate. Okay, but because of the Greek conquest and the Roman conquest, that debate is there. Like I mentioned, the same thing is seen in, of course, Afghanistan and in Iran. Okay, so it's a debate. There is a mix of cultures there, So Gaddafi saw himself as, to get to the point, okay, as a kind of minority. And so he did not really go out to try to enforce his views, of course, which was Islam as a system, okay. But he was more of a Pan-Africanist for that very reason, bringing African leaders together and saying, look, we must resist the hegemony of the West, we must establish ourselves as a power in Africa. And of course, that kind of muted his notorious stature in the West as a terrorist, okay? That is the truth. Remember the truth. I remember the Lockerbie bombings, which was attributed to Libyans. I mean, a few Libyans, and Gaddafi was pointed as probably the cause. Okay, so this is the problem. Okay, so his Pan-African stature kind of muted his influence in this, and he is known to have influenced many leaders, one of which may have been Sani Abacha, and it is rumored that this may have led to the assassination on Sani Abacha himself and subsequent death of Gaddafi, instigated by the West. So immediately these people died. Of course, we know that first of all, before Abacha had died a long time ago, right there about around 2008, and 1998, and in 2001, we know what happened: the attack on the World Trade Center. Okay. Gaddafi was still alive then, but shortly after the Americans attacked Afghanistan, okay, and killed Bin Laden, the next thing was they encouraged the uprising in Libya that brought down Gaddafi and resulted in the death of Gaddafi. So this is the general context that was created, okay, by the conflict between the West and the steering up of North Africa down into West Africa of Islam itself. Okay, they were steering up Africa, in resistance to Western civilization, and this was what it led to. So while these people had died, Abacha had died, Gaddafi, Bin Laden had died, Gaddafi had died. I believe personally that there was need for the rise of new leadership. Okay. Of course, we know that Iran has always been involved in these things, but through proxies, it has been discovered, of course. But I believe that it was an important shift, the rise of the Iranians as an important power in the very scheme of things came about through the death of these three people, okay? And of course, the baton was kind of passed to Iran. Now remember, Saudi Arabia is always there, but Saudi Arabia is governed by leaders who are liberal leaders, okay? Because of their belief that mostly that the religions, Christianity and Islam themselves have a relationship. Of course, this may have arisen from leaders like Salahuddin, who kept to such beliefs after he defeated Christian forces in Jerusalem centuries back. Okay, so this is the thing. So there are the Sunni and the Shia sects have this difference. Okay, one is more radical than the other. And so the baton was passed to Iran, I believe. And of course, this came late in the rule of Ahmadinejad, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of course. He's not too liberal, but he was more liberal than the current group of leaders in Iran, okay? So it came late in that time when there was a need for passing of baton to a new leader. Of course, whatever the aim of that network was, we don't know. Okay, because those proxies, those Islamic proxy groups, are divided into many groups. Okay, the Hezbollah, the Al Qaeda, the ISIS. We have different groups all over the world. So I believe that this happened late during the rule of Ahmadinejad. Okay, and this is when the insurgency began in northern Nigeria. Okay, in Borno to be specific. So this is what happened, and you discover that these things keep on coming up because the aim of these groups, which have currently may have their leadership in Iran, has not yet been fulfilled, and the aim is to establish Islam as the true religion. Of course, within this center called the Middle East, down into Africa, especially. Okay, of course, it's a religion that wants to spread its tentacles all over the world and probably get to rule the world. And this will take us to the next very important point, which is the problem with a hardline Islamic state. We'll look at this after this short break.
Discover a transformative journey into the kingdom of heaven. Following the initial publication, the author dives deeper with two insightful follow-up books. Ever felt disconnected from God even in worship? Explore how God's unconventional ways can transform your life. How can you align with divine plans, avoiding distractions? Find answers in The Kingdom of Heaven on Earth and The 3, Illuminating Christian Truths and Prophetic Practices. Unlock profound insights guiding you toward a deeper connection with God. Don't miss out. Dive into this enlightening exploration today. Click the link on the caption to get your copy.
So the problem with a hardline Islamic state, wherever you see the West having issues trying to suppress, as it were, any Islamic state, it has a very long history. And of course, some people will be quick to link it to the Crusades. Of course, early in about 1200 through to 1500 AD. Okay, the Crusades began, and what was it about? The Crusades, having succeeded in stopping the advancement of Islam in southern Europe, in France and in Spain, okay, the rulers of the newly united Europe, not really united, but when they gained their ground, Europe was was actually ruled by the Romans in modern day Italy today. And of course, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Islam took advantage of that, to spread its tentacles, try to take over that space. Okay, and like I said, it succeeded in doing that quite a bit. But the European rulers decided to wake up and begin to resist them, and there arose a movement in Europe to now begin to push back in the real sense. And that pushing back was an idea that, okay, they should go back and retake Jerusalem, which was seen as a center of Christianity, okay, which was now very popular in Europe. All right, so this is the issue. The idea was, let's take back Europe, Jerusalem. And of course, historians will tell us that it was actually a rabble. It was started by just a movement of a few knights who were not very popular themselves in Europe. They said, let's try this. And when they succeeded, it now attracted a bigger group of people, led by the King of France. Okay, that led the more organized group that we now know today as the Crusaders. Okay, so this happened. Now from there was a to and fro war. Islam would fight back, they would fight, retake the city, and like I mentioned, Salahuddin was a key figure in this, one of the last caliphs of the Muslim empires, okay, one of the last well-known caliphs of the Muslim empires. That's before the Ottoman Empire became stronger and took over. Itself was in Europe, and that is why the Ottoman Empire is one that is known today as one of the most popular, and Turkey is very important in the scheme of things. Okay, so Salahuddin was there, and the popular film The Kingdom of Heaven, of course, those of you who have watched that can get a little background in that. There are many books also written on this, like the book written by Aliboa and many more. Okay, so these continue, but later on, when the British Empire became strong, they became a center of Protestant Christianity. There arose, a series of attempts from that source to, have a firm hold of that area called the Middle East. Hitherto it was led by Catholic dominated countries like, of course, France, Italy itself, and all that. But there was need for the evangelicals to have a presence. Okay, of course, I believe so. And this led the British to also try to plant their own flag in the Middle East. And this led to conquest in the Middle East. Now, the aim of this was, first of all, to stop Islam itself from trying to spread to Europe, which it often attempted to do. And, of course, this kept stability in those countries in Europe, as well as their claim, their historical claim to Christianity itself. And of course, this continued for a long time. At the time now that modern civilization had taken over and Britain was planted there, France had a claim there, of course, Italy too, through the Roman Catholic churches. Of course, they had lost a lot of ground, but Christians, historical Christian churches like the Orthodox Church had their presence there in the Middle East while suffering a lot of persecution, and tended to seek help from these Christian countries in Europe. And of course, an important place where this happened was in Ethiopia, okay, where we know that the Muslim conquest, Ethiopia was one of the last countries, Christian enclaves in Africa, that was conquered by the Islamic forces. And the Western forces now discovered that they had to also intervene in this. And of course, that conquest was cut short because the Portuguese came in and rescued the Ethiopians from this conquest, okay, and gave them back their independence. So this is what we see. And from then on, there was this awareness that Western Christianity or Western nations had a responsibility, if they wanted to keep their claim in Jerusalem and also stop Islam from destroying Christianity worldwide, they would have to intervene in these countries. And these led down to their intervention also in West Africa, their intervention in other parts of the world. And it is still the spirit that is leading the intervention up to today. We will look at that on its own after this show. Well, through history, it is known that Europe itself had a silent period, and that is where the debate comes to the motive behind some of these struggles, okay? Is Christianity really governed by a spiritual force? And are these spiritual forces fighting? Or is it just the human need, for relevance? And the argument can be on both sides. That, if I own a territory, okay, I discover that I need partners. Because I often would have enemies within as well as without. So sometimes if I'm comfortable in my little space, the enemy without tends to succeed if I don't have other partners outside. So the over dependence on the partnership within is really short-lived, in that I have to try to expand my space. If not, I will lose strength from inside, especially that the roots of Christianity are there in Jerusalem and have very strong connections there in North Africa. Okay, and so it is discovered that the Christians in Europe discovered that, look, it is not enough for us to have this practice Christianity here in Europe, there in Europe, of course, but we have to, regain those territories because of course, preserving the faith itself. Okay, and also trying to make sure that the enemy, trying to make sure that the enemy from without is also pushed back. Okay. So this is what instigated that move, okay? And yes, we can say that God himself, of course, in Matthew chapter 28, the motive of Jesus Christ in coming to die for sins and resurrecting is that the gospel is preached all over the world. And of course, anything that limits the gospel, while Islam claims to be the true religion, denies the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, and his position as the Son of God. Okay, so in that sense, of course, you know that God wouldn't want, yes, to encourage that, and that is why he would, in whatever way he could, instigate the nations of the West to return and do their job. Of course, there was that law during the Dark Ages, okay, that led to the transatlantic slave trade. There was that law where Europe didn't care. Of course, after the Crusades, Europe didn't care, okay? Of course, and you may say that within this period, this is what led to the migration of Europeans out of the United States, Europe into the United States, because these were Christians who believed that the church had left, its first love and was on the wrong track. So that establishment, as well as the division of the church there in Europe itself, establishing the Protestant churches, all took place within this period called the medieval period, which was preceded by the Dark Ages, what is called the Dark Ages, of course, and created a polarized church. And of course, this is what led to the English making an inroad into the Middle East, and and also this also happened with the Portuguese, because it was the Portuguese that rescued the Ethiopians from the grasp of the Islamic kingdoms that had conquered Ethiopia, which was the last remaining enclave or Christian kingdom that was left, okay, for a brief period, okay. And of course the Portuguese came in and reversed that process, okay. And of course, because they had discovered the need to protect their territory, not only in Jerusalem but also in North Africa, where Christianity was thriving, okay, under the Ethiopians. And of course, but still, the existence of slavery within that period, of course, coming out of perceived European enclaves, which was America was one of them in those days, was part of this negative influence. And we know that within this period that spanned between the period of the transatlantic slave trade right up to the 1800s, the Arabians were involved in slave trade and the Americans were involved in slave trade. But what happened in America and in the UK was that slave trade was abolished, okay. And of course, this can still be blamed on the existence of that hidden force, probably God himself, who was able to do that. And the result of that was the missionary expedition of people like David Livingstone, who came into Africa and discovered rife increase in slave trade that was still being perpetrated by the Arabs, okay, and indigenous African leaders themselves. and so began to fight against this proliferation of slave trade. And this opened the door for colonialism to return. Okay, and the French and the British began to colonize Africa again. Of course, the Portuguese were already there. So this is what was happening. Okay, so that need to protect Christian heritage and to also have partners from outside so that you don't die from inside, created the now move of Europeans, into Africa again, this time not to engage in slave trade, but to protect and to spread Christianity. Okay, so this continued during the, and of course to also get raw materials, of course, a human thing. Okay, so this now began this time that we find ourselves today, where certain forces from within Islam are trying to fight against this, because this resulted into the colonization of Islamic countries by Britain, by France, and of course the need for them to fight against that came up, and people like Gaddafi and other well-known Islamic leaders in the Middle East arose on and off, to do this. Now, like I have said, to round up on this, the problem with the hardline Islamic State is that it tends to be expansionist. And of course, expansionist in the sense that in doing jihad itself, there is no room for any other dissenting view. Okay, Christians are sometimes allowed, but they have to pay heavy taxes. And of course, within that suppression, of course, there will always be a fight back. Okay, and hardline Islamic states will always want to conquer the world. So if the West fought its own people, led by Hitler, the Nazis, okay, the Nazis were Christians, although they tended to fight anybody who resisted them, both Christian or whatever, If the West came together to fight Hitler, of course they would have to fight any other state that had seemed to have the same philosophy, which was world conquest, because the ideals of the West were on freedom, democracy, freedom, okay, and freedom and human rights. So these are the ideals that gave birth to a new West that abandoned slavery and decided to begin to fight for the freedoms of people all over the world. We will continue to look at this in that light, the movement in Europe, okay, and see how it led to what is happening now. This video is not meant to look at the revolutions that occurred in Europe, the formerly feudal European empires that were led by Christian monarchs, and that later on became more of people-led governments, that overthrew the monarchs and led themselves. The same thing happened in Russia, okay, where Orthodox Christianity still existed, okay. So this is the thing. We're not looking at that today, but we have already mentioned a key event, and that is the abrogation of slavery in the United States and in the UK, which led to many Christian revivals, and which led to the effort by European nations to recolonize territories in Africa, okay? Some in the name of protecting remaining Christian kingdoms like in Ethiopia, and some just in the name of quote and unquote civilizing these people that were actually living under the burden of slave trade, okay. In those days, even the Islamic kingdoms were themselves not living by their initial ideals, and had allowed a lot of slavery, slave raiding and all that. And the leadership of the West in abrogating slavery in their own territories led to that leadership in returning into Africa, and through their own conquest of Islamic states, formerly Islamic states, restoring a kind of hegemony in Africa, and allowing Christian missionaries to establish churches and give the pagans a chance also to have a voice in that light. It is actually a myth, if you look at it, that these efforts, the efforts at colonization, were purely Christian efforts. There are a lot of documents that point to various arguments between the colonials and the missionaries. While the colonials only wanted to protect the African people, and in that light, often even sided with Islam. Okay, the missionaries were on Christian evangelism. Okay, and that is why some writers have said that the British actually protected Islam in northern Nigeria and did not sufficiently protect the Christian communities, okay, which is still being criticized up to today, okay, because in Nigeria, like in Nigeria for instance, when they came into Nigeria, they could identify with the kind of feudal emirates that existed in places like Kano, in Borno, and in Sokoto, and so, had some kind of nostalgia, about what they were practicing there. The British also practiced a monarchical system, although a more modernized democratic form of monarchy that allowed democracy. But they saw this in the kingdoms that existed in northern Nigeria and decided not to excessively interfere. Okay, and so the work of establishing Christian churches in Nigeria, especially, was purely a missionary adventure, a Christian missionary adventure, especially led by the evangelicals and, yes, in some areas, the Catholics. Okay, so this is very important to note. Okay, and that is why Islam today is still very strong in Nigeria, because the colonials never excessively interfered with Islam. Now, this is part of the reason the Western countries still have a right to do what they are doing, in my view. Okay, because they never forced their own religion on Islamic countries. In fact, it's well known in countries like Morocco and Algeria and in Libya that these Islamic clerics had a very, very, very strong voice, even within vis-a-vis the domination of the British and the French. Okay, so this is very well known. And because of that, they maintain the right to continuously interfere in the states. While some might see it as excessively siding with Christianity, it is just in the light of protecting freedom, human rights, the freedom of speech and association. Okay, so this is just what it is, as well as, of course, protecting Western interests, their right to come in and grab for themselves what they want. Of course, all those things are there. So this was what was going on in Europe. Okay, Europe had changed from purely Christian enclaves. It had become a democratic center for democracy, and this also happened in the United States. The United States itself gained its independence, and of course, the idea of democracy and freedom, okay, free trade, freedom to move around, associate, took over the Western civilization, and this was the primal moving force in intervening in any country, whether Islamically dominated or dominated by traditional views, or even Christian views as well. We remember the history of Ethiopia, where the Italians actually invaded Ethiopia and removed Haile Selassie as the last emperor of Ethiopia. Of course, the United Nations stood by him and he returned. But arguably, this was not purely a Christian move. It was more of a move to protect democracy and human rights, rather than Christianity as a system itself. And this is the West that we see up to today. And so, though a lot of people might see Trump as a puppet of evangelical Christianity, this is not truly so. Okay, the evangelicals have just become very powerful because there is a crisis within the United States itself, emanating from Europe, you know, about liberal values. What actually constitutes liberal values? Okay, democratic values. And in that light, the evangelicals are a strong voice in this, in the United States. And this is what has strengthened Trump to be able to take the stand he's taking. Believe it or not, when you look at it strictly from Christian standpoint, he's not even doing enough. Okay? But of course, recently, he has started doing that. But then, if you look at it from the history, he's not even doing enough. And this is the issue at stake. Okay? So these are points to note in the war in Iran today. And whatever position you might take, you might have to listen to this video and, you know, to take a more balanced view. I am David Dungi Chinke for you today in Searching